Hey there, folks. Jeremy from the Seeds of Liberty podcast here again with another installment of Abolitionist Abstractions. This week I want to discuss the recent filibuster by Senator Rand Paul. In full disclosure, I did not watch any of said filibuster. First and foremost because I don't particularly care. But it was hard to avoid as all of social media was abuzz with comments, hashtags, whatnot, having to do with the goings-on down in Washington. The one thing that's rather disheartening to me is I see a lot of self-described libertarians, even ones that would consider themselves small L libertarians, even some anarchists, claiming that they're going to stand with Rand. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, I do happen to subscribe to Lysander Spooner's notion on voting, that it is not necessarily consent. For instance, if you are voting in some kind of local election on some type of ballot measure in order to ensure that, some tax gets decreased or taken away altogether, or you have, if you have a town that wants to itself puts up the proposition to negate some federal law or, the drug laws, something like that, then that's an act of self-preservation. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there, one of my co-hosts on the Seeds of Liberty podcast included, who believes that voting is violence at pretty much any and all times. But like Spooner, I look at it and say, well, yes, if you are voting in some general election to get some person in particular elected so that they can pass the laws that you want passed so that your will can be imposed on others, then that would absolutely be an act of aggression. However, you cannot universalize that, because voting such as in such a manner as the ways I described just before, you're not aggressing against anybody. You are trying to protect yourself and in turn protect others around you. The analogy is, well, if you're a slave on a plantation and your master tells you that he's going to put it up for a vote whether or not you should receive less whippings and better food and accommodations, would that mean that you're consenting to the system by voting for such? Hardly. You are looking out for your own self-interest and not aggressing against anybody by doing so. So, with that said, I still can't understand the fascination with this stand with Rand idea, because he is a politician, first and foremost. He is most definitely not his father. His father, Ron Paul, has done an incredible amount for liberty in general and just waking up to people to the ideas of liberty. And by lots of estimations, he's actually helped create a whole ton of anarchists who listened to his words, took them to their logical conclusions, and have now foregone the state altogether. Rand, however, is definitely not his daddy. Sure, he says a lot of great things, but he is highly inconsistent in his message. Take, for example, the first filibuster he did, which I actually did watch, was shortly after I had given up on statism altogether, but I happened to be around that day, and I was curious to what he had to say, and I actually found myself entranced by a lot of it. Not that I necessarily believed all of it, but I thought on some level it was kind of impressive that a sitting senator was actually getting up and saying some of these things in front of what ended up being a live TV audience on C-SPAN. But, you know, that one, he was talking about the drone program and how wrong it is to be sending drones to foreign countries and killing people based on minimal evidence, and ending up with what the U.S. government loves to euphemistically call collateral damage, which really just means innocent people were killed for no reason. So he got up there and talked for hours upon hours upon hours about that, said a lot of great things, and I think it was only a few short weeks later that he was quoted as saying that while he stood against the current government drone policy in regards to foreign policy, he thought they were perfectly acceptable to be used domestically, say if somebody was robbing a liquor store. Say what? It's not okay to use them overseas and kill innocent people based on minimal evidence, but it's perfectly acceptable to use them here based on minimal evidence? Not very consistent, Rand. You run into the same problems with him with declaring that he's for loosening or getting rid of the sanctions against Cuba, but still wants them put in place against places like Iran, Syria, those horrible countries that harbor these terrorists. That itself is a joke, because the definition of terrorism is using violent means to attain political aims, and that's what government itself does. So by the U.S. federal government's own definitions of terrorism, their armed forces are the biggest terrorist organization the world has ever known. But that's besides the point. So he is very inconsistent. Now, I've heard quite a number of, again, self-described libertarians, anarchists, voluntarists even, stating that they stand with Rand because they believe that he is just playing the game, saying some of the quote-unquote right things just to get himself in office, and then once that happens, he will reverse course and he will show his true libertarian side, and do things that people like us would like to see done. Now, whether this is true or not, to me, is irrelevant, because if it is true, then what does that say about you? That you are willing to support a person that will willingly lie to get what they want. That puts you in an ends justify the means scenario, and that is always a dangerous line of thought, and history dictates that it leads to very nasty results. If it's not true, then he is just another politician trying to curry favor wherever he can, so he can get into a larger position of power and then impose his will upon others. So in either scenario, I see supporting him as a lose-lose proposition. Yes, he may say some wonderful things. Yes, he may even mean some of these wonderful things. But at the end of the day, he is still willing to use the violence of the state to attain those ends. And that is not a very moral choice, and not one that I can get behind. Now, another problem is, sure, he gets up there, speaks in front of the floor of Congress and says these wonderful things, but what does it actually accomplish? Now, there are a number of people that would suggest that he's just helping educate the public, and he's waking people up to these horrible things. You know, like I said, last time it was the drone program. This time it was, I guess, about the Patriot Act. Like I said, I really didn't pay attention to it other than what I was deluged with on social media. But the Patriot Act has been in effect since, 2001? If people aren't aware of the far-reaching implications of that act by Congress in 14 years, I am pretty sure some politician getting up on TV and bloviating about it is not going to change their minds or make them any more aware. Now, I'm sure it's possible that it reached some people, but to me, it seems like nothing more than trying to curry political favor. Even if he says things that are true, I believe he's using the wrong methods to do it, because there's people that are not in political office, everyday activists, that have been screaming about this for years, and not much has changed. You know, I think even the ever-hallowed SCOTUS recently came down with a decision stating that the actions of the NSA, that, you know, the collection of all the data that the Patriot Act supposedly makes legal, was actually unconstitutional. Now, this presents a couple of problems, because number one, that hasn't stopped government from taking certain actions in the past before, and also the whole idea of something being deemed unconstitutional is slightly ridiculous, because the Constitution, or Constitution, as I like to refer to it as, was drafted by a small group of men, allegedly based on the consent of the governed, and through the actions of the subsequent generations, one of the more important ones being the Lincoln administration, that supposedly hallowed piece of paper has been codified into law in perpetuity, and it rests on the entire premise that what is deemed constitutional or unconstitutional, those decisions will come from some section of the government. Now, most of us were taught to, indoctrinated to believe in the so-called separation of powers. This, of course, is another ludicrous notion, because these so-called separate powers all reside within the same overarching government. They are all the agents of these separate powers are paid from the same trough of extorted money, and government itself has a vested interest in making sure that government stays in power. So that means that government is the final arbitrator on what is constitutional and unconstitutional. So virtually everything they do, it does, can be considered constitutional as long as it deems that it wants it to be constitutional. With laws written in vague language, contradictory terms, purposely used to distract the masses, and the overarching theme of legalese being used so that the average person thinks they must rely on the so-called experts to determine such matters. And a lot of them won't bother to investigate further than what they get from their particular brand of state-sponsored media. So Rand Paul, or any senator or congressman or any politician at any level getting up and screaming about the unconstitutionality of a particular action by government is either incredibly naive or is being intellectually dishonest. Because, as I just laid out, any action taken by government in its current form can be considered constitutional as long as that's what government wants. Now, before Lincoln's act of destroying the republic to preserve the Union, the idea of secession, while not often talked about in glowing terms, was a supposed reality. You know, even Jefferson and Madison, who wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 and 1799, discussed the idea of nullification, which secession is tied to, and that was supposedly a right of the sovereign states that if the newly formed federal, centralized power, the newly formed federal government usurped the powers that were supposedly granted to it by the people, then those sovereign states could simply walk away from the compact. Now this, of course, all changed with Lincoln's actions, and since then, secession, nullification, these have become dirty words, and to speak of them is blasphemous. It's rather unfortunate because if the purported intent of the Constitution and the assurances that were made during the ratification conventions in the individual sovereign states was true, and if it was followed the way it was, purported to be, and Lincoln had allowed the southern states to simply secede as they wanted to, that would have set the ultimate precedent for secession, because then it would be impossible to argue against individuals seceding. That happens to be something I'm a huge proponent of. I encourage people as often as I can to opt out of the state at every possible opportunity. and make sure they know that secession, when it comes down to it, is not just for a state to take. Secession on the individual level is one of the, if not the most important tools in attaining true freedom. So Rand Paul can get up there and bloviate about how these actions are unconstitutional, and he wants to help change the system. But in the end, I don't see him changing much of anything. He has already proven himself, to me at least, to be no better than most politicians, because as I pointed out earlier, he's rather inconsistent in some of his messages. Now, he does not claim to be a libertarian, although a lot of people want to put him in that camp, both those on the left and right who want to do so pejoratively, and then those who are actually seeking freedom that want to cling to any hope that they may still possess, that it would be possible to rectify this situation through political means. But whether he claims to be one or not, whether he's a secret one or not, he's proven himself to be widely inconsistent. And as history will show you, once a man sets aside his so-called principles once, it becomes that much easier to do the next time, and the next time, and the next time. So when Rand Paul, or any politician, claims to be principled, but at the same time also makes it known that they are willing to play the political game to get certain results thereafter, whether that be voting for something that goes against their principles based on assurances from other criminals or politicians that will help him out when he has something that he wants passed, or whether it's just voting to say that you are part of the system and you're not shirking your duties. It's very hard to be principled at all, especially if those principles are in the libertarian vein of being against the initiation of aggression, because everything a politician does initiates aggression, down to them accepting their paycheck, which comes from the aforementioned extorted means. So, like I said, I'm very disheartened to see so many so-called libertarians, anarchists, voluntarists claiming that they will stand with Rand, as if this is going to solve anything. Because, like I said, even if he's pulling a fast one on everybody just to get into power, if you approve of that, you are saying that the ends justify the means, and that is dangerous, dangerous thinking. So, I do not stand with Rand. I do not stand with any politician. I stand for the individual. I stand for non-aggression. And I stand for true freedom. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. This has been Jeremy from the Seeds of Liberty podcast with another edition of Abolitionist Abstractions. Peace.